Wealthy heiress humiliates waitress and makes her cry in front of everyone. Days later, the rich woman's father finds out what happened and makes a shocking decision that changes her life. Clarissa Bennett made her grand entrance into Le Jardin, an exclusive restaurant known for its refined atmosphere and high-profile clientele. Her every move was a display of luxury, her outfit a curated collection of designer labels, her wrists glittering with diamond bracelets that caught the light just so. As she walked, the stiletto heels of her Louboutin pumps clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, signaling her presence before she even reached her table. Heads turned and whispers floated in the air, but Clarissa was used to the attention. It was her birthright after all. Anna, a young waitress at the restaurant, had been working tirelessly through her shift, balancing orders and clearing tables with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. She was used to the demands of the wealthy patrons who frequented the establishment, but she prided herself on treating each one with respect, no matter how difficult they might be. So when she approached Clarissa's table, tray in hand, she was polite and professional. Though inwardly a bit nervous, Clarissa was known for being particularly difficult to please. The mistake was small, almost insignificant. Anna had brought the wrong dish, a mix-up in the kitchen, nothing more. But for Clarissa, it was an unforgivable offense. Her eyes narrowed, and the air around her seemed to chill as she scanned the plate in front of her. Without giving Anna a chance to explain or correct the error, Clarissa's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the dining room like a blade. "Are you completely incompetent?" she demanded, her tone dripping with disdain. "This isn't what I ordered. Do you even know how to do your job?" Anna's face turned pale as the blood drained from it, leaving her feeling lightheaded. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to muster an apology. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'll fix it right away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Clarissa wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she unleashed a tirade that echoed across the room. "I don't want excuses. I want results. If you can't even manage something as simple as this, maybe you should find a job more suited to your skills, like cleaning toilets." The words hit Anna like a slap in the face. She felt the sting of tears forming in her eyes, but she fought to keep them at bay, not wanting to break down in front of the entire restaurant. The other diners had gone silent, their discomfort palpable as they pretended not to hear the exchange. Some shot sympathetic glances in Anna's direction, while others looked at Clarissa with a mix of shock and disgust. But Clarissa remained oblivious, basking in her own sense of superiority. Anna managed a shaky nod, murmuring another apology before turning on her heel and hurrying back to the kitchen. As she pushed through the swinging doors, the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, tracing hot, angry paths down her cheeks. She leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breathing, but the humiliation clung to her like a heavy weight. All she wanted was to disappear, to erase the last few minutes from existence. But the memory of Clarissa's scornful words echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, Clarissa resumed her meal, her expression one of smug satisfaction. To her, the incident was already forgotten, a mere trifle in her day. She sipped her wine, oblivious to the ripple effects of her actions, and to the fact that this single moment of cruelty would soon unravel the comfortable life she had always taken for granted. Mr. Bennett sat across from his longtime business partner, Mr. Hargrove, in one of the city's most exclusive clubs. The room was adorned with dark wood paneling and soft leather chairs, the atmosphere steeped in old money and quiet power. They had been discussing the usual, stocks, mergers, and the latest market trends, when Mr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair and casually brought up an event that had stuck with him since it happened. "You know, Richard, I was at Le Jardin a few days ago and I witnessed something quite unsettling." Richard Bennett raised an eyebrow, curious but not overly concerned. "Oh? What was that?" he asked, taking a sip of his scotch. He had known Hargrove for years, and while the man was rarely one to exaggerate, Richard wasn't prepared for what came next. Hargrove's tone shifted, becoming more serious as he continued. It was your daughter, Clarissa. She humiliated a waitress there in front of everyone. It was brutal, Richard. I was shocked, to say the least. I thought you might have heard about it. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He sat up straighter, the relaxed ease of moments ago evaporating instantly. Clarissa? What did she do? He demanded, his voice hardening as his mind raced to make sense of what he was hearing. Hargrove went on to describe the incident in detail, sparing none of the ugly truths. He spoke of the way Clarissa had belittled the young waitress, how she had made a spectacle of her mistake and reduced her to tears without a second thought. As Mr. Hargrove spoke, Richard felt a cold dread settle in his chest. This wasn't just some petty misstep, it was a reflection of his daughter's character, of the person she had become. Each word that left Hargrove's mouth seemed to slice through him, bringing with it a sharp pain of realization. Richard had always prided himself on raising Clarissa with strong values, instilling in her the importance of hard work and respect for others. But now it was clear that somewhere along the line, those lessons had been lost on her. By the time Mr. Hargrove finished recounting the event, Richard's face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly. He barely managed to keep his composure as he thanked Hargrove for telling him, his mind already racing ahead to what he had to do next. Thank you, Harold, he said, his voice tight. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Hargrove nodded, a sympathetic look in his eyes. I'm sorry, Richard. I know how much you value humility and respect. I just thought you should know. As they parted ways, Richard's thoughts were consumed by a mixture of anger, shame, and deep disappointment. How could his daughter, his own flesh and blood, behave in such a cruel and callous way? The realization that Clarissa had turned into the very kind of person he had always despised, a spoiled, entitled brat who looked down on those who worked for a living, was almost too much to bear. He couldn't ignore it, and he certainly couldn't let it slide. The drive home was a blur, the city's familiar streets passing by unnoticed as Richard prepared himself for the conversation he dreaded but knew was necessary. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that this confrontation would change everything, but he also knew that he had no choice. Clarissa needed to learn that her actions had consequences, and if he had to be the one to deliver that lesson, then so be it. The disappointment in her was palpable, a weight that seemed to press down on him with each passing moment. By the time Richard pulled into the driveway of his sprawling estate, his resolve was firm. Tonight, he would confront Clarissa. He would make her understand the gravity of what she had done, and he would do whatever it took to ensure she learned the value of humility. As he stepped out of the car and walked towards the front door, the usually comforting sight of his home felt different, colder somehow. The walls that had once echoed with warmth and love now seemed to close in, preparing to witness a confrontation that could shatter the fragile balance of their lives. Clarissa entered her father's study that evening with an air of nonchalance, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the desk lamp that cast long shadows on the dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that lined the shelves. The study was a place of quiet authority, a sanctuary where Mr. Bennet handled his most pressing affairs, and it was rare for Clarissa to be summoned there. She assumed it was some trivial matter, perhaps another reminder about her responsibilities or an inquiry about her latest shopping spree. She was caught off guard when she saw the expression on her father's face. He stood behind his massive oak desk, his hands resting on the surface, knuckles white. His eyes, usually calm and composed, were now intense, filled with a mix of disappointment and anger. "Sit down, Clarissa," he said, his voice carrying a weight she wasn't used to. The casual smirk on her face faltered as she took a seat, suddenly feeling the tension in the room. She opened her mouth to ask what this was about, but her father cut her off before she could speak. "I had lunch with Harold Hargrove today," Mr. Bennet began, his voice steady but with an underlying edge. "He told me something very troubling, something I couldn't believe until he described it in detail. Clarissa's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Mr. Hargrove's name and the serious tone in her father's voice sent a chill down her spine. Her mind raced, trying to remember anything that could have led to this confrontation. But the answer came swiftly as he continued. He told me about what happened at Le Jardin, about how you humiliated a waitress in front of the entire restaurant. Clarissa's face paled, and she felt her stomach drop. The memory of the incident flashed before her eyes, but she quickly masked her unease with indifference. "Father, it was nothing," she started, waving her hand dismissively. "The girl was incompetent. She brought me the wrong dish, and I simply corrected her. She needed to learn to do her job properly." Mr. Bennett's eyes darkened, and his voice grew cold. "Corrected her? Clarissa, you didn't just correct her. You berated her, humiliated her in front of a room full of people, and made her cry. All over a simple mistake." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing into hers. "Is that what I've taught you? To treat people as if they're beneath you because they make an error? To belittle those who are working hard to make a living?" Clarissa bristled, her pride wounded by the harshness of his tone. "Father, you don't understand. She was disrespectful, and I was just showing her that she needs to do better if she wants to work in a place like that." But even as she spoke, she knew her excuses were weak. The look on her father's face told her that he wasn't buying it. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the walls of the study closing in on her. Mr. Bennett didn't raise his voice, but the sternness in it left no room for argument. "No, Clarissa, what you did was disgraceful. You have no right to treat anyone with such cruelty, especially not someone who is working to provide a service. I've worked hard my entire life to build this family's fortune, but I've never forgotten where I came from. I've always valued humility, respect, and hard work. And yet, here you are, acting like an entitled brat, throwing around your privilege as if it makes you better than others." Clarissa opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips as her father's expression hardened even further. "Enough," he said, cutting her off. "I've heard enough excuses. Your behavior was unacceptable, and there will be consequences. You will not be allowed to continue living your life this way. It's clear that you've forgotten what it means to be part of this family, and it's time you learned." The finality in his voice sent a shiver down Clarissa's spine. She had never seen her father this angry before, and the realization that he was truly disappointed in her was like a punch to the gut. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in, but she could only sit there, stunned and silent, as the weight of her actions came crashing down on her. Mr. Bennett's stern gaze never wavered as he took a deep breath, ready to deliver the decision that had been weighing on him since he'd learned of Clarissa's behavior. "Clarissa," he began, his tone firm but with a hint of sadness, "I can't overlook what you've done. Your actions were cruel and completely unacceptable. Therefore, I've made a decision. As of this moment, I am cutting off your access to the family's wealth indefinitely." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Clarissa's eyes widened in shock, her carefully composed expression cracking as the full weight of her father's words hit her. "What? You can't be serious!" she exclaimed, her voice rising with panic. The idea of losing her access to the money that had always been there for her, that had funded her luxurious lifestyle, was unthinkable. Her mind raced as she tried to grasp the enormity of what her father was saying. Mr. Bennett remained calm, though the disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. "I am very serious, Clarissa. You've shown me that you've lost sight of what truly matters: respect, humility, and the value of hard work. If you want to regain my trust and have access to the wealth you've taken for granted, you're going to have to earn it back." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "To start, I've arranged for you to work at Le Jardin, the very restaurant where you humiliated that poor waitress. You'll begin tomorrow." Clarissa stared at her father, stunned into silence. The thought of working as a waitress, especially in a place where she was known as the spoiled heiress, filled her with dread. It wasn't just the physical work that horrified her. It was the idea of being seen in such a lowly position by people who knew her, people who would undoubtedly relish her downfall. The humiliation of it all was overwhelming. "Father, this is ridiculous. I can't work there. Do you have any idea how humiliating that would be?" Her protest was met with a steely resolve that she had rarely seen in him. "Humiliating? Clarissa, the only thing humiliating here is your behavior. You need to understand how your actions affect others. And there's no better way to do that than by walking in their shoes. This isn't just about punishment. It's about learning a lesson that you clearly need. And you will start learning it tomorrow." Clarissa's heart pounded in her chest, her anger and resentment boiling just beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to storm out of the room and refuse, but she knew her father well enough to understand that he wouldn't back down. The look in his eyes told her that this was non-negotiable. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she knew there was no way out of this. "Fine," she spat out, barely able to contain her fury. "I'll do it, but don't expect me to enjoy it." Mr. Bennett's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "This isn't about enjoyment, Clarissa. It's about growth. I hope, in time, you'll come to understand why this is necessary." He stepped back, signaling that the conversation was over. Clarissa stood there for a moment, her mind reeling from the shock and anger that coursed through her. She had no choice but to accept her father's ultimatum, though every fiber of her being rebelled against it. As she left the study, her footsteps heavy and her face flushed with indignation, Clarissa's mind buzzed with resentment. How could her father do this to her? The thought of spending even a single day working at Le Jardin, dealing with customers and serving food like some common worker, filled her with dread. She had always looked down on people in those positions, never imagining that she could one day be in their place. The humiliation of it all was unbearable, and yet, deep down, a small, unwelcome part of her wondered if this was the harsh wake-up call she needed. Clarissa woke up the next morning with a sense of dread settling heavily in her stomach. The realization that today was the day she would start working at Le Jardin, a place she had once frequented as a privileged customer, filled her with anxiety. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. Instead, she dressed in plain, practical attire that felt foreign on her. As she drove to the restaurant, the familiar streets seemed different, less welcoming. The confidence that usually accompanied her every step was nowhere to be found, replaced by a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. When she arrived at Le Jardin, the sight of the elegant facade that once symbolized luxury and indulgence now represented a challenge she wasn't sure she could handle. As she stepped inside, the restaurant's warm, inviting atmosphere seemed to mock her, reminding her of how different this day would be compared to her previous visits. The restaurant manager, Mr. Davis, a man with a calm demeanor and a professional air, greeted her. He knew the situation and had been instructed by Mr. Bennett on how to handle her first day. "Good morning, Clarissa," he said, his voice neutral. "Let's get you started. You'll be working alongside Anna today." The mention of Anna's name made Clarissa's heart skip a beat. Of all people, why her? She steeled herself for the inevitable confrontation, but when she was introduced to Anna, the waitress simply nodded and greeted her with quiet professionalism. There was no trace of the incident in Anna's demeanor. If anything, she seemed determined to treat Clarissa like any other new employee. This unexpected reaction caught Clarissa off guard. She had braced herself for scorn or a cold shoulder, but instead she found herself facing a woman who appeared focused on the job rather than the past. As the day progressed, Clarissa was given a crash course in the daily grind of restaurant work. She was tasked with taking orders, delivering food, and cleaning tables. Simple tasks that suddenly felt overwhelming. Every order felt like a test, every tray of food a challenge. Her hands shook slightly as she jotted down orders, and the weight of the trays seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The pace was relentless, with no time for the leisurely breaks she was accustomed to. For the first time, she understood the pressure of maintaining the high standards expected in such an upscale establishment. By midday, Clarissa's feet were aching, her back sore from bending over tables, and her nerves frayed from trying to keep up with the demands of the job. She had never imagined how physically exhausting and mentally draining it was to work in a restaurant. The constant flow of customers, the need to stay alert and attentive, the juggling of multiple tasks. It was also different from the life of ease she had always known. She could feel the sweat on her brow, a stark contrast to the polished, unruffled image she had always maintained. As the shift wore on, Clarissa began to notice the small details she had previously overlooked. The quick, efficient movements of the staff, the quiet camaraderie among the waiters, and the genuine smiles they offered to even the most demanding customers. She realized that these were people who took pride in their work, who dealt with pressure and challenges every day without complaint. And then there was Anna, who moved gracefully through the dining room, her demeanor calm and composed. Clarissa couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as she watched Anna work, remembering how she had treated her not long ago. When the shift finally ended, Clarissa was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. Her feet throbbed, her arms felt like lead, and her pride was bruised. As she left the restaurant, the reality of what she had learned began to sink in. She had spent years looking down on people who worked these jobs, dismissing them as insignificant. But now, having walked a day in their shoes, she felt a deep sense of shame for her previous arrogance. And yet, despite this newfound awareness, a simmering resentment towards her father still lingered. She resented him for putting her in this position, for forcing her to confront the parts of herself she didn't want to acknowledge. Driving home, Clarissa couldn't shake the mixed emotions swirling within her. The shame, the exhaustion, the resentment, it was all there. A confusing tangle of feelings she wasn't ready to sort through. All she knew was that this experience had shaken something inside her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face what that meant. The days that followed were a blur of early mornings and late nights, each shift at Le Jardin pushing Clarissa to her limits. The resentment she had initially felt toward her father and her situation began to ebb, replaced by a growing awareness of the world around her. As she moved through the dining room, taking orders and balancing trays, she started to notice the small details she had previously overlooked. The genuine camaraderie among the staff, the quiet determination in their actions, and the way they supported one another through the daily grind. All of it painted a picture of resilience and dignity that was new to her. Clarissa couldn't help but observe Anna more closely as they worked side by side. Despite the long hours and the demanding customers, Anna remained unfailingly polite and cheerful, her smile never wavering. Clarissa wondered how someone could maintain such a positive attitude in the face of the relentless pace and constant pressure. She watched as Anna juggled multiple orders with ease, offering a kind word to every customer, even those who were less than pleasant. It was clear to Clarissa that Anna wasn't just going through the motions. She genuinely cared about her work and the people she served. The more time Clarissa spent with her co-workers, the more she began to understand the challenges they faced. Many of them were juggling multiple jobs, working tirelessly to make ends meet and support their families. Some were single parents, others were caring for elderly relatives, but all of them shared a common trait: an unwavering commitment to their responsibilities. This realization was humbling for Clarissa. She had never had to worry about money, had never experienced the kind of financial strain that her colleagues dealt with every day. The contrast between their lives and her own privileged existence was stark, and it forced her to confront her previous arrogance. Her interactions with the restaurant's customers also began to shift. At first, she had resented them for their demands, seeing in them a reflection of her old self, entitled, dismissive, and impatient. But as the days passed, Clarissa found herself approaching each table with a new perspective. She started to understand that each person had their own story, their own struggles, and that these weren't always visible on the surface. With this understanding came a newfound respect, a desire to treat each customer with the dignity they deserved, regardless of their attitude or behavior. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Clarissa found herself lingering in the break room, too tired to move. The room was small and plain, a far cry from the luxurious spaces she was used to, but it had become a place of quiet refuge after long hours on her feet. Anna entered a few moments later, wiping her hands on a towel, her face flushed from the evening's work. Clarissa looked up as Anna approached the small table where she sat, and for the first time, she felt a pang of guilt that she couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, Clarissa finally spoke the words that had been sitting on the tip of her tongue for days. "Anna, I want to apologize for how I treated you before. I was wrong and I'm truly sorry. I didn't realize how hard this job is, and I had no right to speak to you that way." Her voice was shaky, the vulnerability in her words surprising even herself. She had never been one to admit fault, but something in her had changed, and she knew that this apology was long overdue. Anna paused, her expression softening as she took in Clarissa's words. For a moment she said nothing, simply watching Clarissa with a calm, steady gaze. Then to Clarissa's surprise, Anna smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Clarissa," she replied, her voice gentle. "I appreciate that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. And for what it's worth, I'm glad to see you've learned something from this experience." Her kindness was unexpected, and it touched something deep within Clarissa, sparking a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. The simple exchange left a profound impact on Clarissa. Anna's gracious acceptance of her apology was a stark contrast to the coldness Clarissa had once shown her, and it made her realize how far she had come and how far she still had to go. For the first time, she felt a genuine sense of remorse for her past actions, and with it, a strong desire to change, to become the person her father had always hoped she would be. The path ahead was uncertain, but Clarissa knew one thing for sure. She could no longer ignore the lessons she was learning, nor could she go back to the person she once was. The weeks that followed marked a profound change in Clarissa, both in how she viewed the world and how the world viewed her. Each day at Le Jardin, she found herself growing more committed to her work, arriving early to set up the dining area and staying late to help clean up after the last customer had left. The tasks that had once seemed beneath her now became opportunities to prove her worth, not just to others, but to herself. She took pride in every table she set, every order she delivered, and every smile she managed to elicit from a satisfied guest. The work was still exhausting, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a chance to rebuild herself. Her colleagues, who had initially kept their distance, began to notice the change in her. At first, they were skeptical, suspecting that Clarissa's newfound humility might be an act to appease her father. But as the days turned into weeks, they saw something different, a genuine effort to fit in, to contribute, and to learn. Clarissa started to ask for advice, seeking out tips on how to improve her efficiency and better serve the customers. She began to offer help where she could, whether it was covering shifts, taking on extra duties, or simply lending a sympathetic ear during breaks. Slowly but surely, the walls that had once separated her from the rest of the staff began to crumble. Clarissa's relationship with Anna in particular deepened in unexpected ways. What had started as a cautious truce after Clarissa's apology evolved into a friendship rooted in mutual respect. They would often find themselves working the same shifts, their once awkward silences replaced by easy conversation. Anna, with her quiet wisdom and steady demeanor, became something of a mentor to Clarissa, teaching her the finer points of the job with patience and kindness. They shared stories about their lives, and Clarissa was humbled by the challenges Anna had faced and overcome. In return, Clarissa began to open up about her own struggles, revealing vulnerabilities she had never shared with anyone before. As Clarissa immersed herself in the work and the lives of those around her, she began to understand the deeper meaning behind the values her father had always tried to instill in her. Respect, she realized, wasn't something that could be commanded or bought. It had to be earned through actions that demonstrated integrity, empathy, and commitment. This understanding brought with it a sense of fulfillment that was entirely new to her. Gone were the days of shallow satisfaction derived from luxury and status. Instead, she found herself fulfilled by the simple yet profound act of earning the respect of those she had once looked down upon. This transformation did not go unnoticed by Mr. Davis, the restaurant manager. He had been watching Clarissa closely, monitoring her progress with a critical eye. Initially, he had agreed to take her on at the request of her father, expecting to deal with a spoiled heiress playing at being a waitress. But what he saw over the weeks surprised him. Clarissa's dedication was real, her attitude genuine. She was no longer the aloof, entitled woman who had walked into the restaurant weeks ago. She had become a part of the team, earning the trust and respect of those around her. Mr. Davis, who was not one to give praise lightly, found himself quietly impressed. The change in Clarissa's demeanor was also evident in the way she interacted with the customers. She no longer saw them as mere transactions, but as individuals, each with their own story. Her once guarded and impatient demeanor was replaced by a warmth that surprised even herself. She learned to listen, to empathize, and to engage in ways she never had before. This new approach didn't just make her a better waitress, it made her a better person. She began to feel a deep sense of connection with the people she served, finding joy in making their dining experience a pleasant one. By the end of each shift, Clarissa felt a sense of satisfaction that was entirely new to her. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that made her feel accomplished, but the knowledge that she was contributing to something larger than herself. The respect she had earned from her colleagues, and even from the regular customers who had noticed her change, filled her with a pride that no amount of wealth or privilege had ever given her. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be part of a community, to belong somewhere because of who you were, not what you had. In these quiet, reflective moments after the restaurant had closed and the last customer had gone home, Clarissa would often find herself thinking about her father. The resentment she had once felt towards him for putting her in this position had faded, replaced by a deep gratitude. She realized that the lesson he had forced her to learn was one of the most valuable gifts he had ever given her. It was a lesson not just in humility, but in humanity. And as she locked up the restaurant and walked to her car each night, Clarissa knew that she was no longer the same person who had walked through those doors weeks ago. She had changed in ways that mattered most. The lunch rush was just beginning to taper off when a man walked into Le Jardin, his presence commanding attention even before he opened his mouth. He was impeccably dressed, but his expression was one of deep dissatisfaction, as if the very air offended him. The hostess greeted him with her usual warmth, but his curt nod and dismissive wave set the tone for what was to come. Clarissa noticed him immediately, sensing trouble before he even reached his table. When Mr. Davis assigned her to serve him, she braced herself, knowing this would be a true test of her newfound patience and professionalism. As Clarissa approached the man's table, her mind flashed back to the countless times she had been in his position, demanding perfection, belittling the staff, and expecting the world to revolve around her whims. The memory of her own past behavior filled her with a mix of shame and resolve. This time, she would be different. The man barely glanced at the menu before barking his order, his tone dripping with disdain. "Make sure it's hot," he sneered, "and not overcooked like last time." Clarissa nodded, her face composed, and assured him that everything would be to his satisfaction. Throughout the meal, the man's attitude didn't improve. He complained about the temperature of the soup, the seasoning on his steak, and the speed of service. each comment more cutting than the last. But Clarissa remained unfazed. She responded to his complaints with grace, apologizing where necessary and calmly addressing each of his concerns. Her demeanor was so steady, so unflappable, that it began to have an unexpected effect. The man who had come in ready to make someone's day miserable found himself disarmed by her calm professionalism. As the meal progressed, Clarissa's unyielding patience began to wear down the man's hostility. He watched her closely, perhaps expecting her to snap under the pressure, but instead, she met his every criticism with quiet competence. By the time dessert was served, a change had come over him. His earlier sneer had softened into something resembling a frown of contemplation. When Clarissa returned with the check, he looked up at her with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. "You handled that well," he said, almost reluctantly. "I've been a bit difficult, haven't I?" Clarissa allowed herself a small, understanding smile. "It's no trouble, sir. I'm just glad we could make your experience here better." The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sorry for the way I've acted. It's been a rough day." His apology was unexpected, but it felt genuine, and Clarissa's smile widened. Not in triumph, but in genuine appreciation for the moment of connection. He signed the check and left, his demeanor noticeably lighter than when he had arrived. After the man exited, leaving a generous tip behind, the staff who had witnessed the interaction couldn't help but exchange impressed glances. Mr. Davis, who had been observing from a distance, called Clarissa into his office shortly after. The office was small, with shelves lined with binders and a desk cluttered with papers, but it exuded an air of quiet authority. As she entered, Mr. Davis looked up from his paperwork and gestured for her to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about what just happened," he began, his tone serious. Clarissa sat down, her hands folded in her lap, still a bit nervous despite the calm she had maintained during the shift. Mr. Davis leaned forward, his eyes softening as he continued. "I watched how you handled that customer, and I have to say I'm impressed. You showed incredible patience and professionalism, even when he was at his worst. That's not easy, and it shows how much you've grown since you started here." His words were measured, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "You've become an invaluable member of this team, Clarissa. I want you to know that." Hearing those words, Clarissa felt a swell of pride, unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It was different from the shallow pride she used to feel from flaunting her wealth or receiving superficial compliments. This was something deeper, rooted in hard work, personal growth, and the respect she had earned through her actions. For the first time in her life, she realized that this sense of accomplishment, this recognition from someone she respected, was worth more than any material possession she had ever owned. As she left the office, Clarissa couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The day's challenge had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she had risen to meet it, not just as an employee, but as a person. The test she had passed wasn't just about dealing with a difficult customer. It was about proving to herself that she had changed, that she had truly learned the lessons her father had intended. The sense of fulfillment that filled her now was a new kind of wealth, one that she knew she would carry with her long after she left Le Jardin. The evening was serene as Clarissa drove up the long, winding driveway leading to the Bennett family estate. The house, a grand structure that exuded old-world charm and elegance, stood as a reminder of the life she had once known, a life of luxury, ease, and privilege. Yet as she approached the familiar entrance, she realized that something within her had shifted. The grandeur that once filled her with pride now felt distant, almost foreign. She parked her car and took a moment to steady herself before stepping out, her thoughts a swirl of anticipation and reflection. Mr. Bennett greeted her warmly at the door, his eyes filled with a mixture of affection and curiosity. The dining room, with its high ceilings and crystal chandeliers, was set for a formal dinner, just as it had been so many times before. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. There was a quiet intimacy in the air, a sense of something unspoken yet deeply understood. Clarissa noticed the small details, the way her father had chosen her favorite wine, the subtle floral arrangements that mirrored the ones her mother used to love. These touches reminded her that, despite the challenges of the past few months, she was still his daughter, and this was still her home. As they sat down to dinner, Mr. Bennet didn't rush into the conversation. He allowed the first course to pass with light talk, discussing the weather, the stock market, and a few mutual acquaintances. But Clarissa could sense that the real discussion was still to come. It wasn't until the main course was served that Mr. Bennet set down his fork and looked at her intently. "Clarissa," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I've been eager to hear about your experiences at the restaurant. It's been several months now. How have you found the work?" Clarissa took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. This was the moment she had been preparing for, yet the words felt surprisingly difficult to express. "It's been challenging," she admitted, her voice sincere, "but it's also been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I've learned so much about myself and about others. Working at Le Jardin, seeing how hard everyone works, understanding the pressures they face every day, it's opened my eyes. I used to take so much for granted, but now I see things differently. I've come to value humility, respect, and the importance of hard work in a way I never did before." Mr. Bennet listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a proud, almost wistful look in his gaze, as if he were seeing his daughter anew. "And how do you feel about your future now?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Do you still want to return to the life you had before? Or has this experience changed your perspective?" Clarissa hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had thought about this moment countless times, wondering how she would respond. "I've thought a lot about that," she began slowly, choosing her words with care. "The life I had before, it was comfortable, but it was also empty. I was surrounded by luxury, but I felt unfulfilled. Working at the restaurant, connecting with people, earning their respect, it gave me a sense of purpose that I never had before. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to continue working, to keep learning and growing, and I want to use what I've been given to help others who haven't had the same opportunities." Her father's expression softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you, Clarissa," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "You've grown into the person I always knew you could be. You've earned back my trust, and I'm ready to reinstate your access to the family's wealth, if that's what you want. But I can see that you've found something more valuable than money, and if your heart is leading you in a different direction, I will support you no matter what." The offer was tempting, a return to the life she had once known, but Clarissa knew in her heart that she had outgrown that world. "Thank you, Father," she replied, her voice steady and sure, "but I don't want to go back to that life. I want to continue working, and I want to find ways to make a difference, to help those who are struggling. I've been given so much, and I want to use it to do something meaningful." Mr. Bennet reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then that's what you'll do," he said, his voice filled with pride, "and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." The warmth of his words filled Clarissa with a sense of peace and fulfillment. She had come full circle, rediscovering her place in the world, not through wealth or status, but through the strength of her character and the choices she had made. This was the woman she had always been meant to become, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly content. With a renewed sense of purpose and her father's unwavering support, Clarissa set out to make a meaningful impact on the lives of those around her. Returning to Le Jardin felt different this time. No longer was she the reluctant waitress, but a determined woman with a clear vision. She walked into the restaurant with her head held high, ready to present her ideas to Mr. Davis and the staff. The familiarity of the space with its polished floors and ambient lighting now held a deeper significance for her. It was the place where she had rediscovered herself, and she was eager to give back to the community that had unknowingly guided her transformation. Clarissa's proposal was met with a mix of surprise and gratitude. She explained her plans to invest in the restaurant, not just financially, but in a way that would improve the quality of life for the staff. Her first initiative was to raise wages, ensuring that every employee was fairly compensated for their hard work. She also introduced a new benefits package that included healthcare and paid time off, things she had once taken for granted, but now understood were essential for a stable life. Her goal was simple: to create an environment where people felt valued and respected. In addition to these changes, Clarissa launched a scholarship fund specifically for the restaurant's employees. She had seen firsthand the dedication and potential in her co-workers, many of whom had dreams that extended beyond their current roles. The scholarship was designed to help them achieve those dreams, whether it was furthering their education, pursuing a new career path, or gaining skills that would enhance their lives. Clarissa personally contributed a significant amount to the fund, and her father matched her donation, proud of the path his daughter had chosen. Anna, who had become more than just a co-worker, but a true friend to Clarissa, was one of the first recipients of the scholarship. When Clarissa shared the news with her, the joy and disbelief in Anna's eyes brought tears to both their eyes. "You deserve this, Anna," Clarissa said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've worked so hard, and I want to help you achieve your dream of becoming a chef. I know you'll be amazing." Anna, who had never expected such an opportunity, hugged Clarissa tightly, words of thanks tumbling out between sobs of happiness. For Clarissa, seeing Anna's reaction was more rewarding than anything money could buy. The changes Clarissa implemented at Le Jardin had a ripple effect. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted noticeably. There was a newfound sense of camaraderie and enthusiasm among the staff. Customers began to pick up on the positive energy, and it wasn't long before the restaurant's reputation for not only its food, but also its excellent service began to grow. Clarissa's role in these changes didn't go unnoticed. She became a respected figure in the local community, admired for her dedication to making a difference. But for Clarissa, the true reward was the fulfillment she felt every day, knowing she was contributing to something that mattered. As the months passed, Clarissa watched with pride as Anna thrived in her culinary studies. With the scholarship's support, Anna enrolled in a prestigious cooking school, where she quickly became one of the top students. Clarissa visited her often, delighting in the progress her friend was making. The once shy and reserved waitress was blossoming into a confident, skilled chef, and Clarissa knew that the world would soon see just how talented Anna truly was. Their friendship had deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experiences that had transformed both their lives. Clarissa's journey from a life of privilege and entitlement to one of purpose and compassion had come full circle. She had not only earned back her father's trust, but had also redefined what success meant to her. No longer was it about wealth or status. It was about the impact she could have on others, the difference she could make in the world. As she stood in the restaurant one evening, watching the staff work with a sense of pride and contentment, she realized that she had found her true calling. The path she had chosen was one of kindness, respect, and service to others, a path that had brought her a happiness she had never known before. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.